Welcome to another deep dive. We're going to be taking a look at researcher Dan Winter's work and his ideas about how ancient technologies might have tapped into the power of consciousness.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating area, this, where science and spirituality seem to converge. Where ancient wisdom might hold some clues to unlocking human potential.
Absolutely. Our source material for this deep dive is an interview with Dan Winter and another researcher named Tony, and they're discussing this concept called Aperture.
Okay.
They believe it connects to everything from seeing holograms to connecting with ancestors. I have to admit, I'm pretty intrigued to see where this goes.
Well, what's captivating about Dan Winter is that he draws parallels between ancient practices and modern scientific concepts, kind of prompting us to rethink our understanding of both.
Yeah. To kick things off, they use the analogy of a pinhole camera. That simple box with a tiny hole that projects an image. And they talk about how the size of that pinhole is super critical. What happens if the hole is too small or too big?
If it's too small, not enough light gets through to create a clear projection. Too large, and the image becomes blurry and undefined. It has to be just the right size.
Right, like Goldilocks. Not too big, not too small. Just right.
Yeah.
And that's where it starts to get really interesting. Dan Winter suggests that the optimal pinhole size allows for this implosion of energy. He even calls it an event horizon, like a mini black hole. And then he connects this to the human eye and the idea of focused attention. What do you make of that connection?
Oh, it's a really thought-provoking idea. What he's essentially saying is that focused attention, that narrowing of our mental focus, could create a similar implosion of energy within our own consciousness. It's like our awareness becomes a lens, focusing our perception.
So then how does this idea of an event horizon in our consciousness relate to expanded perception?
Well, Dan Winters suggests that this implosion, this focusing of energy, might allow us to perceive things beyond our normal senses. It's like our consciousness is being projected outward or perhaps inward to connect with a larger field of information, almost as if we're tuning into a different frequency of reality.
Right. That brings us to these sacred spaces or longitudinal nodes that they keep mentioning. What are those exactly?
Picture lines of magnetic energy converging on certain points on Earth. What Dan Winter argues is that these nodes are like powerful amplifiers for consciousness, like energetic gateways or portals.
Okay, so these nodes amplify consciousness. What kind of experiences are we talking about?
Well, they discuss things like telepathy, remote viewing, and the ability to connect with a kind of collective consciousness. It's a bit like tuning into a cosmic internet, gaining access to information that's normally hidden from our five senses.
It all sounds incredibly intriguing, but also a bit out there, even for me. Is there anything in our everyday experience that might relate to these ideas?
Well, think about how certain places evoke a sense of awe or wonder. You know how they feel energetically charged? Ancient cultures often built temples and sacred sites in these locations, intuitively recognizing their power.
Right.
Perhaps these are places where the veil between realities was thin, where access to these longitudinal nodes was more readily available.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that Dan Winter connects these ideas about aperture and nodes to ancient technologies. I'm really curious to learn more about that. Where do ancient structures fit into all of this?
Well, Dan Winter and Tony suggest that many ancient structures like obelisks and stone circles were built to interact with these nodes. It's like they were creating antennas, tuning into these energetic frequencies and amplifying their effects.
But what would be the purpose of interacting with these nodes? What were they trying to achieve?
Well, the interview suggests that these structures might have functioned as machines for amplifying intention and even potentially healing. Perhaps they were designed to enhance consciousness, connect with other realms, or manipulate energy in ways we're only beginning to understand.
This is all starting to sound like something out of a science fiction movie. But the fact that these ideas are rooted in both ancient wisdom and modern physics is really intriguing.
Yeah, that's the beauty of exploring these concepts. It forces us to question our assumptions about what's possible and consider that ancient cultures may have possessed knowledge and abilities that we're only just beginning to rediscover.
Okay, so we've got these pinhole cameras, event horizons, and energetic nodes. Let's dive into some specific examples of ancient technologies and how they might have harnessed these principles. What's our first stop on this historical tour?
Let's start with the Olmec people of ancient Mexico, who transported these massive blue stone heads across incredible distances. What's interesting is that they chose a very specific type of blue stone, with high dielectric properties.
Now, I'm not a physicist, so could you break down what dielectric properties are and why they might be significant in this context?
Sure, dielectric materials have the ability to store electrical energy. And Dan Winters suggests that the Olmec people deliberately chose these blue stones because their high dielectric properties facilitated a connection to their ancestors.
So they believed that these stones could act as a conduit for consciousness, allowing them to communicate with those who had passed on. It's almost like they were using them as ancestor phones.
It's a fascinating concept, isn't it? They believe that these stones could somehow bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual realms, allowing them to tap into a source of ancestral wisdom and guidance.
And this wasn't just limited to the Olmec civilization, right? They also talk about obsidian mirrors, which were used by cultures like the Aztecs, and even figures like John Dee, the famous advisor to Queen Elizabeth I.
Exactly. Obsidian mirrors, especially when polished to a high sheen, can act as phase conjugate mirrors. These mirrors have unique properties that allow them to, in a sense, embed consciousness into a larger array.
Could you explain what you mean by embed consciousness into a larger array? It sounds incredibly complex.
Think of it as amplifying and transmitting a signal, in this case, a signal of consciousness. These mirrors, according to Dan Winter and Tony, could facilitate ancestor phone calls and practices like scrying, which is a form of divination using reflective surfaces.
So the idea is that these mirrors weren't just reflecting physical images, but also tapping into a deeper level of reality, allowing them to connect with other realms and perhaps even see into the future.
That's the essence of it. And they even suggest that Nostradamus, the famous prophet, used a phase conjugate mirror to see into the future, the concept being that through deep empathy, he was able to connect to a future timeline and pull those events into his present perception.
All of this is mind-boggling. We've gone from pinhole cameras to ancestor phones to potentially seeing into the future. What other ancient technologies did they discuss in the interview?
Well, they spend quite a bit of time discussing obelisks, and this is where Tony's research comes into play. He has this theory that obelisks, especially those placed near water, functioned as energy machines.
Okay, now I'm really curious. Energy machines. What kind of energy are we talking about, and how would an obelisk function as a machine?
Tony explains that the sheer weight of an obelisk, modulated by the natural vibrations of the Earth, known as Schumann resonances, could interact with piezoelectric materials in the ground.
So before we get too far into this, what exactly are piezoelectric materials, and how do they relate to obelisks and energy?
Piezoelectric materials have this fascinating property of generating an electric charge when pressure is applied to them. So Tony believes that this interaction between the obelisk's weight, the Schumann resonances, and piezoelectric materials could charge and structure the water nearby.
So essentially, the obelisk acts like a giant piezoelectric crystal, converting mechanical energy into electrical energy that then influences the surrounding water. But why focus on water? What's so special about it?
Tony believes that water has a unique ability to store and transmit information, a concept supported by Dr. Masaru Emoto's water crystal experiments. And he suggests that these obelisks weren't just influencing the water's energy, but potentially embedding specific intentions into it.
So we've got obelisks potentially acting as energy machines, charging and structuring water, and maybe even imbuing it with specific intentions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to see how these seemingly disparate elements, pinhole cameras, mirrors, obelisks, might be connected through this concept of aperture and energetic nodes. But how does this all tie back to the power of consciousness?
That's the key question, isn't it? If Tony is right, it implies that these ancient cultures possessed a deep understanding of energy and consciousness that we're only just beginning to grasp.
This has been a whirlwind of information. Before we move on, are there any other specific examples of obelisks and their potential connection to water that they discuss in the interview?
Yeah, they actually mention a few. Tony points to the Vatican obelisk, which stands prominently near fountains, and the Bogli Gardens obelisk in Florence, a region renowned for its exceptional water quality.
Huh. It's like they were integrating these structures into the very fabric of their cities, maybe to enhance the vitality and well-being of the people who live there.
That's one interpretation, and it kind of raises this question about whether these ancient principles could be applied in modern urban planning and architecture.
Right.
Could we create spaces that not only serve practical purposes, but also nurture our consciousness and our connection to something greater?
It makes you wonder if we could create spaces that not only serve practical purposes, but also nurture our consciousness and connection to something greater.
Right. And Tony also brings up a few more modern examples that align with this idea. He talks about the capital city of Kazakhstan, Astana. And you find these towers arranged in a specific pattern. positioned at a distance that corresponds to significant wavelengths. And there's a dammed river nearby, creating a substantial body of water.
Huh. It almost sounds like they might be replicating this obelisk-water interaction, but on a grander scale.
It's a compelling observation, isn't it? And he doesn't stop there. He mentions the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, Missouri, which is situated a specific distance from the Mississippi River. It seems like this principle could be more widespread than we initially realize.
I'm beginning to see patterns in places I hadn't considered before. It's like a hidden code embedded in the landscape, hinting at a deeper understanding of energy and its connection to consciousness.
It definitely invites a shift in perspective. Moving back to Dan Winter's work, though, he seems to believe that these technologies weren't just about manipulating energy, but also about expanding perception and connecting to a larger reality. He refers to it as the physics of clairvoyance, suggesting that these practices allow us to embed ourselves into this longitudinal array.
Okay.
It's almost like tuning into a cosmic internet, accessing information typically hidden from our senses.
That sounds amazing, but I need a little bit of help wrapping my head around it. What exactly does he mean by longitudinal array, and how does it relate to expanded perception?
Imagine this field of information that permeates everything. Not merely electromagnetic energy, but something more fundamental.
Okay.
It's like a universal consciousness that connects all things. A unified field.
And are these ancient technologies, these nodes, acting as portals into that field?
Precisely. They create a resonance, a harmonic alignment, allowing our consciousness to expand and perceive this deeper reality.
Earlier, we talked about the idea of seeing holograms. And I'm wondering if that's part of this. Is it possible that these practices allow us to perceive a holographic reality layered on top of our everyday world?
That's a very insightful connection. Modern physics is exploring theories like the holographic universe, suggesting that our reality might be more akin to a projection than a solid, fixed thing. Perhaps these ancient cultures were tapping into a level of reality we're only beginning to glimpse.
This is all pretty mind-blowing. I can't help but think about all those ancient myths and legends that we often dismiss as mere stories. Could they actually contain encoded wisdom about the nature of reality and the potential of human consciousness?
It's certainly worth considering. Many ancient cultures believed that humans possessed these latent abilities that could be awakened through specific practices and technologies.
It makes you wonder if we've lost touch with something essential, something that our ancestors understood intuitively.
Right.
Maybe we're not as far removed from them as we think. Perhaps we've just forgotten what we're capable of.
I think that's a powerful takeaway from this deep dive. One of the most striking aspects of the interview was what Dan Winter and Tony said about empathy. Dan Winter believes that experiencing this deep connection to the larger array through these technologies naturally leads to a greater sense of unity and understanding of others. He even suggests that a lack of empathy might be an anomaly in a universe that's fundamentally interconnected.
It's like our modern world, with all its emphasis on individuality and separation, has caused us to lose sight of our inherent connection to each other and the cosmos.
Exactly. And if we can reconnect to that sense of interconnectedness, if we can cultivate greater empathy, it could have profound implications for how we relate to one another and the world around us.
It makes you think about the potential for healing, not just on a personal level, but on a global scale. What if these ancient technologies and practices hold the key to resolving conflicts, bridging divides, and creating a more compassionate and harmonious world? It's a beautiful and inspiring thought.
Yeah, it really does. It makes you wonder if we've been looking in the wrong places for solutions to some of our biggest challenges.
Right.
Maybe the answers lie not in further technological advancements, but in rediscovering and integrating ancient wisdom into our modern lives.
It's a compelling argument for bridging the gap between science and spirituality, for recognizing that the two aren't mutually exclusive, but rather like complementary perspectives on the same underlying reality. This whole deep dive has been an incredible journey. I feel like my understanding of ancient cultures, technology, and even consciousness has been completely transformed.
What stands out to you the most from our exploration?
Honestly, it's the sheer breadth and depth of knowledge that these ancient cultures seem to have possessed. It makes you realize that our modern worldview might be far more limited than we realize.
Yeah, it's a humbling realization, isn't it? And it opens up a world of possibilities for what we might be able to achieve.
Yeah.
If we can tap into that ancient wisdom and integrate it with our modern understanding.
If these principles were known and utilized in the past, What possibilities exist for us to rediscover and apply this knowledge in the modern world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Could we use this understanding to create new technologies that enhance our well-being and foster greater connection and empathy? Imagine the potential for healing, for communication, for personal growth, if we could harness these energetic principles.
It's almost too much to fathom. It makes you think about the ethical considerations as well. If these technologies are as powerful as they seem, we need to approach them with a great deal of responsibility and wisdom.
Absolutely. It's not just about rediscovering these technologies, but also about understanding their potential impact and ensuring that they're used for the betterment of humanity and the planet.
It's a reminder that knowledge without wisdom can be dangerous. We need to cultivate both in equal measure if we want to create a future that's truly aligned with our highest potential.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. It's not enough to simply acquire knowledge. We need to develop the wisdom to apply it ethically and effectively.
Well, this deep dive has definitely sparked a sense of wonder and curiosity in me.
Yeah.
I'm eager to explore these ideas further and see how I can integrate them into my own life.
And that's ultimately what we hope to inspire in our listeners. A sense of exploration, a willingness to question assumptions, and a desire to connect with something greater than themselves.
Well, I'm so grateful for your insights and guidance on this journey. I feel like I've learned so much, and I know our listener has too.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always a joy to dive deep into these fascinating topics and explore the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern science.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Dan Winter's work, we'll leave our listener with a final thought to ponder. If ancient cultures understood how to utilize these principles to expand consciousness and connect to a larger reality, what potential exists for us to rediscover and apply this knowledge in our modern world? The journey of exploration and discovery is ongoing. Keep asking questions, keep seeking, and keep an open mind. You never know what wonders you might uncover.